Arteta! What a strike! What a screamer! Zola! And a fantastic goal! Arsenal back in it! And here's Limpar, lines it up, finds the net. Arsenal are in front.
When speaking about the 2007-2008 Arsenal team, I think Donald Trump summed it up best when he was talking about coronavirus. It'll be like a miracle. One day it'll be here, and then it'll be gone. This is the Arsenal Vision post-match podcast. My name's Elliot Smith. You can block me on Twitter, Yankee Gunner. That's right. Maybe that's not going to be true of coronavirus, but it was certainly true of the 2007-2008 Arsenal team that Arsene Wenger built to replace the Invincibles. I don't know if you know this, but this just in, they did not replace the Invincibles. Here to discuss it with me is Scott. You can find him on Twitter, _that_crap. Hello, Scott.
Yeah.
See, you were on mute thinking you'd get a later introduction. You had to snap forward. See, I like to keep you on your toes because I wasn't sure if you would be keyed in, but you were and you did it. So thank you. Paul's on Twitter. Pause my pants.
Yeah, normally I'm last.
Oh,
so.
yeah, normally you're last. Yep. And now go back to being last. Paul's on Twitter. Pause my pants. Hello, pause.
What an amateur. Woohoo.
Woohoo indeed. And Tim's on Twitter. Roberto. Hello, Tim.
Hello there. Hopefully this episode doesn't inspire people to inject disinfectant into their lungs.
No. I mean, light helps. If you can get it inside your body, that would be great. I live in Minnesota where it is mostly dark and cold for many, many months. And believe me, if I could get light inside my body, I would. What I will tell you, the easiest way to get light inside your body is to get like a bore and you just bore some holes into your body and then the light can get in. But that causes bleeding.
What the hell is
so
going on?
I wouldn't do that either. We're getting way too topical, sort of like the disinfectant. And so I would advise that we move on. But yesterday, Clive and I did a rewatch of the second half of Tottenham 1, Arsenal 3 from September 2007. And that was great. And if you're a patron, you can certainly listen to that. If you're not a patron, I totally understand. These are weird and hard times. And certainly the last thing I'm going to do is say, definitely sign up. If you're there, we love you. If you're not, you're here. We love you for that as well. One announcement that we have to make, we are going to be donating money to the Arsenal Foundation, and we are going to be joining you, the listener, in doing that, partnering up to try to raise as much as we can. I am working out the details with the Arsenal Foundation as we speak, and we'll have an announcement about that on the very next pod, just as soon as I have the details hammered out. But hopefully we can raise a lot of money for the community for a great cause and help a lot of people out. We, of course, will be donating some money as a podcast, but also giving you an opportunity to join with us and all donate together. So more about that anon. Just need to kind of figure out how to make it happen, to be fair. And they are helping me understand that. And so that is a good thing. So let's talk 2007-2008 Arsenal. And this pod is going to focus on the aftermath. What happened at the end of that season and the subsequent sort of 12, 24 months, why the team did not go on to fulfill some of the promise that it showed during the course of a season where, in February, it was on pace to have the most points in Premier League history. Not unlike a team this year that is also not winning a title. Oh, too soon. So I did write a blog, and since Tim is usually the one being like, oh, I just wrote about this week, I wrote about this week 400 years ago. It's a blog called Arsene Wenger's Lost Team. It is about the aftermath of fallout from that season. It is on a blog called Yankee Gunner Blog, which used to be a thing. I shit you not. And I will link to that after the podcast. But let's dive into it. And Scott, I'll start with you because we haven't heard from you on this season yet. And before we get to the aftermath, I'll just get your take on it. We picked this season apart bit by bit on the last episode. But for you, is this a season that, now that we have some distance from it, is characterized by happy memories or sad memories?
Well, so I didn't really live through this one like I did going back, but this is one that, a while ago I found all of the season reviews posted onto a Google Drive somewhere. I think, Tim, you posted it sometime recently too, talking about all of those. So this is something that I kind of relived through that. And then kind of looking back statistically, and you look at it and it's a fun team. It looks like it's, full of, kind of that transition period, but there was still a lot of talent. It wasn't quite Project Youth yet. So I think looking back, I think, wow, that was a really good team and one that I would have liked to have seen on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis.
It definitely was a team to watch week to week, day to day. Are there any players that maybe then that you didn't get to connect with or only know through your database when you have your spectacles on or through the sepia tone glow of those season reviews that maybe you wish you had seen spend more time at the club?
Well, I think just the midfield in general. I think Cesc and Flamini together were a great partnership. I think you look through the team and just the technical quality was something that we don't necessarily see now, and I think that's something that would have been really nice to be able to kind of relive.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about how midfield today feels like a real problem, and certainly that midfield looked like it was poised to be something special, and it didn't wind up happening. And Tim, there are a lot of aspects to how this team just disintegrated, fell apart so quickly. Before we get into the individual players, where they went, how quickly it happened, I want to ask you sort of like how you think this impacted Arsene Wenger's subsequent decisions to lean into youth or transfer decisions or things like that. Because so you look at the landscape in football at the time, and you have Chelsea with all the money sort of buying up titles, but Manchester City now coming out of the shadow to sort of join them. And obviously, several of these players that were on this team would wind up at City, some sooner than others. I mean, do you feel, you said that you sort of thought that Arsene stumbled onto this team by accident, but how much impact do you think it had that he had this team that had so much promise, that looked like it was very close to being something special? And the strategy certainly would have been to lean into that team, and to have it break up so quickly, I think it would have been very difficult for a manager to suddenly find himself rebuilding again. So how much of this do you think was a plan by Arsene that was really sort of coming together, and that he would have expected to be the long-term strategy? And how much do you think it would have impacted him that he wasn't able to sort of see this one to fruition?
I think it was seismic. I think this is this kind of summer, and maybe the end of the 07-08 season,
yes.
and this summer, I think it's the first. I don't really know how to describe it. If Wenger, if the kind of disintegration of the Wenger reign was death by 1,000 cuts, then this was the first one.
This was like a leg, though. This was not like a little.
Well, I was going to expand the metaphor into the first cut is the deepest.
I'm
and
sorry.
all of that.
Sorry, yeah. Should have given you that.
But this to me is the first time. It's the first time I think that the supporters really start to ask questions at this point, and that perhaps a little bit of that. When I say impatience, I don't necessarily I don't want to sound like I think it's completely unjustified or anything, but that impatience and those questions start to come on the man himself. I think so. Basically, I think this kind of starts, whether you want to call it the second or the third chapter of the Wenger reign, probably the third, really, because you've got the first, and then you've got this little bit either side of the stadium move, and then this is kind of an abrupt beginning to a third chapter that he probably didn't want when he wanted it to be a glorious continuation of the second. And yes, of course, Manchester City come along and things like that, but I think this maybe scarred him a little bit just because of the amount of stuff that went wrong. So like Rosicky getting injured, he doesn't kick a ball in 2008-09. Not one game does he manage, not one squad. He's completely out for the whole season. Eduardo, of course, doesn't come back until January, February 2009, and then he was only really able to do cameo appearances, so that's his season wiped out. So those are two things that we consider traumas of the 07-08 season, but they very much belong to the 08-09 season as well, because we lose those players for that campaign as well. So it's not just that they deny us the title in 07-08. He still has those players. Those players haven't left. They're just not available to him. So on top of the players that did leave, he's got that to contend with, and continuing issues around the fitness of, say, Robin van Persie, the decision to make William Gallas captain, that eventually completely backfires, and in November 2008 he has to strip Gallas of the captaincy, and a lot of this stuff comes to a head, which some of it is completely beyond his control, some of it is coin toss stuff. And it all just basically this is the point really where it just feels like everything starts going a bit wrong, and I think some of that is laid at his door. Some of it is just 50-50 decisions that can go either way, and they went the wrong way. Some of it's slightly at his door, and some of it's completely beyond his control, and it pretty much all goes wrong. And again, on top of the players that actually leave, this is the summer where Adebayor starts agitating because he scored 30 goals, and he starts talking about, describing AC Milan as Beyonce and all of that. And then he eventually gets himself a new contract. And then, I don't know if you remember, he scores at the Emirates Cup. He scores a penalty, and he's booed by the supporters who can see through him, who've kind of said, we don't care that you've signed a new contract. We know what your game is. So that trust breaks down. And you just start to get the slight souring of the atmosphere, and you look at some of the stuff that happened in 08-09 with Adebayor. Also, it comes to a head with Abue in November 08. Like, this stuff just starts bubbling to the surface, and it's the first time we've really seen that under Arsene Wenger, and it's the first time you really get the sense that maybe this isn't all going to plan, because even in those slightly fallow years after the Invincibles, I think not all of us, but most of us, and me, I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I thought, this is fine. This is all part of the plan. We'll have a slight dip, but then these youngsters will all come good and we'll all be fine again. That's what I thought, and I think that's what a lot of people thought. And this is the first time, I think, that a lot of our faith was challenged.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of wild. So you think about it, right? 07-08 was maybe supposed to be a transition year. The last of the Invincibles was basically gone, right? I mean, you've got Gilberto Silva and Jens Lehmann, and that's really it for the most part. And Gilberto takes more of a backseat to Flamini, and that's something we can get to. And Jens Lehmann, after I think 2 games, is replaced for the most part for the rest of the season by Manuel Almunia. So this is the team that's then supposed to be the next project. And from that next project, whether through injury or agitating for a move, I mean, Abu Dhabi, obviously plagued by injuries, hardly ever played. Rosicky, not a game the next season. Diarra, loaned in January, sold. Eduardo, not a game next season. Gallus had to be stripped of the captaincy. Alex Hleb, a season later, off to Barcelona. Matthew Flamini, in the summer, gone on a free. Gilberto Silva would go for good. Adebayor, a season later, gone to Manchester City. And you start to think about, like, a first choice 11 from the 07-08 season, and your two of your strikers or forwards are gone. Your sort of number 10 is gone. Your, whatever you want to call Rosicky, I think he was sort of a starter for the most part. I mean, he started 24 games, gone. It just becomes incredibly difficult for Arsene to have any continuity with this team, and he winds up having to start an almost entirely new project 12 months after this season ends. Paul, I think one of the things that we talked about was the midfield and the importance of the midfield. And I would argue that after this team broke up, Cesc Fabregas played in some really, really mediocre midfields. And I obviously not getting Xabi Alonso is a big part of that. But with Flamini going and Gilberto Silva going and Diarra being allowed to go, suddenly players like Song and Danielson had to come into prominence and play more minutes in subsequent seasons when they weren't really ready to do it. Rosicky was out because of injury. Is midfield and the decision about Diarra and Gilberto Silva and really leaning into Flamini in his last season, is that, of all of the sort of implosions that happen around this team, is that the area where maybe Arsene got it most wrong and had the most devastating impact for the subsequent seasons?
Well, it's a good case for it.
Should he have played? I mean, do you think he got it wrong? I guess part one of this question is, Arsene Wenger got a lot right. I mean, the team played brilliant football. It's hard to argue with it, but he removed leadership from this team in some ways and leaned into some players who maybe didn't have a future, most notably Flamini, at the expense of an experienced Invincible and a talented guy in Diarra who he was a French national. He probably could have made him happy there for a long time. I mean, did he get that wrong? Was that wrong to make that move? Flamini started 40 games. Diarra was off by January.
Well, I mean, if you can't read Diarra right when you're French, he's French, you know everything about him and his background, it's one of those where I'd have to trust Arsene on. He had full information, or as full information as a coach is going to have. Flamini, I mean, in this season, Flamini was great. There was no reason not to think he'd keep being great going forward. Another French fella. Like in the game we watched this week, the Spurs away from home, won 3. Flamini was the business. I mean, the engine on the guys is phenomenal. Really good partnership with Fabregas.
He just didn't have a contract, though. He was ready for that Bozeman.
Look, I'm not nervous about Flamini. He's French. He's on the same wavelength as Arsene Wenger. I think he'll get this sorted in the summer. So yeah, we lost Flamini. But hey, seasons are a thing at a time. At the end of the day, I mean, we're looking seasons ahead. This is as we talked about. I mean, the ice under Arsene was cracking and moving rapidly. I think he was thinking months and a season at a time, not multiple seasons at the time. So he made his decisions. Like you say, when you look at the injuries to these guys, and you listed Song. I mean, Song was good till he got a little wayward in his maybe his attitude, a little cavalier in terms of his role within the team, mainly because he became one of the main guys.
Except, can I make a point about that? I want to push back on that just a little. So Song made 9 appearances in 2007-8. Okay,
sure,
9. He graduated to 31 in 08-09. And I remember in that season feeling he wasn't ready for that much playing time. And I'll never forget Andrew Arsblog wrote a blog about a poor performance in 08. I think it was in the 08-09 season, where he said, "It makes me sad that Arsene Wenger thinks Alex Song is good enough to play for Arsenal." And Song did develop in 2010-11 in particular into a player, and 2011-12, who was good enough to play for Arsenal. Maybe not the best, but good enough. But the disintegration of that 07-08 midfield meant that he was playing 31 games the following season, and in my mind, there is no question that neither he nor Danielson should have been playing that much time at that stage.
Yeah, look, I think that's very fair. I think the other thing in watching this game, the game against Spurs, that struck me was the fragility of this team. I mean, it was great. It was fun. It was exciting. But man, they had 4 1v1s against us. They could have scored off a couple of corners. I think we were deservedly the winners on this. But this was an incredibly swashbuckling team. And the idea that that's how you win the league, even at that time against the competition that it was, a very strong United team, a very well-resourced Chelsea team, that we were on track to do it. You could always see some hiccup coming along. I mean, in this game, we had Van Persie and Adebayor up front. We weren't really using Eduardo at this point. It was September timeframe. I think it was game 5 or 6 or something in the season. So although I often lean into what would have happened if we kept Eduardo, in some ways, we shouldn't have needed him. Fabregas had scored 5 midfield goals by the end of this game, so we're getting goals from all over. Was kind of our way of doing things. But this was great and wonderful, but there was a fragility about it in terms of how we played, in terms of the kind of unevenness of the squad. As Tim hinted about, there was a luckiness to how this was just kind of clicking, giving the quirkiness of how we got to this point and the lineup of the squad. So yeah, when we put our hands in a midfield of Fabregas and often Song in 08-09, I mean we went from being the best team in the league in 07-08 for most of it, to 08-09 being in deep shit and having to bail ourselves out in the January transfer window. So yeah,
and I mean, you think about it, right? You go from having guys like Kleb, Rosicki, Flamini playing 31, 35, 40 appearances to 37 for Danielson, 31 for Alex Song. And it's no wonder why almost overnight that team gets a lot worse. And I just think that is a situation that was partly caused by injury, certainly, right? Diaby not being able to play a lot, and Rosicki missing the entire next season, which, for all the things we think about Rosicki, he never had the ankle break like Ramsey or like Diaby or like Eduardo, but he missed a ton of time. I mean, as much time as anybody. And it really hurt us because it meant guys that were young and not particularly ready and maybe never good enough, like Danielson and Song, played a lot more. I just think the players that had to step in and take playing time in 08-09 would not have had to play as much if the team held together. And certainly the decision not to use Diarra more and the decision to lean into Matthew Flamini despite the fact that he could leave on a free and just remarkably loaning Diarra out to Portsmouth in January, I think precipitated that breakdown in the midfield. Scott, let's just talk 30,000 foot view for a second, squad building. So here you have this team that has played 3/4 of a brilliant season. And whether it's immediately that summer losing guys like Kleb and Flamini, and one or two others, or within 12 months losing tons of key players from Adebayor, Eduardo and Rosicky with injury, Kleb, Flamini, so on and so forth. How many seasons does it take to put a squad together, and what does it do in terms of your time horizon when a team that's been on pace for a record point total, a team that you've built sort of out of thin air and a bit unexpectedly, breaks up that quickly? I mean, how difficult do you think it must have been for Arsene Wenger to pivot and readjust, especially given, look, you can always adjust to players leaving, right? Like, you can adjust to a player going on a Bozeman or a player pushing for a move. What's harder is a Robin Van Persie who plays 25% of the next couple of seasons, a Rosicky who plays none of the next season, Eduardo who plays none of the next season. You wind up with guys like Vermaelen who miss 18 months to injury and things like that. So how difficult would this have been from a squad building standpoint, and how do you assess the way that was handled in terms of trying to rebuild from a team that had just been rebuilt?
Yeah, so I mean, I know we're kind of talking about the midfield there, and that's one of the things that you really notice is, kind of think about what the peak age for midfield is, and you kind of think it's that 23 to 27 range. And, we had, several players in that range that then left, either that next season or right after or in the middle of the season. And so we went from, guys in their peak ages to guys that are right about 20. Looking at the next season, Arsenal didn't have, I guess Diaby is the closest. He's 22 in that 08-09 season. So we basically didn't really have a midfielder in their peak range going after that. So I think squad building, you really kind of want to think about how can we keep players in their peak range and, have people coming in after them. So I think that was something that really got hurt in that we weren't able to necessarily plan for that either through injury or through players leaving. So I think that's something that, you look at, it probably took the midfield, a good 3 years to kind of get back to somewhat close to that level that, we had in 07-09 or 07-08. And I think that's something that, really hurt Arsenal going forward, is that Arsenal had top level players, but they didn't have the depth to be able to do things that the Chelseas, the Manchester United were able to do. So you really had to build for a couple of years to be able to get to being able to challenge for a title. And because we lost so many players over that course of that season, that we just weren't able to do it the next year. And it's kind of rebuilding phase again. And I think that's kind of where we've been over and over again since basically since the Invincibles broke up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I do wonder if to some extent that influenced how Arsene Wenger related to later requests to leave, whether it was Nasri and Fabregas or Van Persie, and then even later in his career, towards the very end, when he didn't sell Alexis, when he didn't sell Mesut Ozil, when maybe he should have. Because, when you have a team like this and you've got a plan in place and you feel like you're working to something special and you see the very first glimpses of that special potential, and you have it taken away from you so abruptly, I can understand how you'd say you'd rather just go with what you know, go with the players you have than letting them go. But of course, he didn't have a say in a lot of that. You talked about strength and depth and maybe not having it, but Tim, one area where we did sort of have strength and depth, interestingly, was striker. And, we talk about the midfield and the breakdown of the midfield and winding up having to rely on players like Danielson and Song the next season instead of Flamini and Rosicky or Diaby and things like that. But when you look at the situation up front, in 2007-08, you've got Eduardo, you've got Van Persie, you've got Adebayor. Now, granted, Van Persie did that thing he does where, he was injured for part of that time. But, I do wonder, with Eduardo being gone the entire next season, Adebayor's head not being right and being ready to leave, and Van Persie having, again, the injury problems, was striker the sort of house of cards that became the biggest problem? Because the Adebayor situation is a major one. I mean, in your mind, let's talk Adebayor for a second. Was Adebayor ever going to be as good as the 07-08 season suggested he could be? Was it a fluke benefited by a team that was just purring all around him? Because he would never really hit those heights again. You could see flashes of the brilliance, and we know he went through some really hard things in his life personally, related to family and related to what happened back home. His bus was famously and terribly shot at when he was on international duty. But is the Adebayor situation sort of the canary in the coal mine in a way, the extent to which he sort of wandered around aimlessly a bit the next season? And was he ever really as good as the 07-08 season suggested?
Yeah, no, I don't think he was. And from memory, I remember a lot of fans saying that they didn't quite think he would be. Not that they thought he'd be terrible or anything, but they really, really felt like, that season wasn't a flash in the pan, but that was a real peak. That came together through a number of things. I think the interesting thing about the striker thing here is that this season, we spoke on the first pod in this series about how Arsenal were kind of flitting between 4-4-2 and 4-5-1. This season, we actually go like quite a bit back to 4-4-2 initially, and it's largely because we have Adebayor and Van Persie. And we don't have Rosicky. So, all right, we've bought Samir Nasri, right? But we don't have Rosicky. We don't have Hleb anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we've the midfield's a bit more depleted. One thing I will say is that Denilson was excellent for this season. That's one thing I'll slightly push back on. I thought he had an excellent season this season.
We started 36 league games and made one sub appearance, so he was ever present. Song went 23-8.
Yeah,
so, I mean, those two were in a lot.
Yeah, and Denilson played that often for good reason. He was really, really good during this season, and but we went 4-4-2 a lot, and I think that was because we'd lost like Rosicky and we didn't have Eduardo and those players who were kind of capable of linking the front line to the midfield. But I think it was also because we had Adebayor and Van Persie. And Wenger kind of, understandably didn't really want to drop either of them. I think the thing for Adebayor as well, it wasn't just that he had, this real purple patch, 7-08. I think mentally he left a part of himself in that season. It wasn't just that he couldn't hit those heights again. It's that he didn't really try. And there were points during this season where he was incredibly frustrating to watch because it was clear he wasn't trying. It was clear he wasn't giving 100%.
Wasn't this really his offside Adebayor season also, like where he would just stand offside at times and just like not try to get back on?
Yeah. It was clear in his mind. He'd made it. He'd got, I think he'd got like a bit of a case of the big I ams. He'd got the big contract. I think his effort and his application just wasn't quite there, because actually Van Persie was relatively, by his standards, was fit for most of this season.
He made 24 league starts, so I mean, by his standards, that's a great season.
Yeah, exactly. It's like more than half. But some weird things happened during this. So. There was a big tactical change, and actually one that was really necessary in a weird way when Fabregas picked up a knee injury in December in a game against Liverpool, and he was out for 3 months. And at the time we were about 7th, and we were thinking, shit, we're 7th, and now we've lost Fabregas for 3 months. And what Wenger did was actually quite necessary tactically, because we'd been playing 4-4-2. We were far too open, and when he lost Fabregas, he started playing Denilson and Song together, and kind of Nasri ahead of them, and that's when he brought Arshavin. And so, by necessity, he went to a much more modern tactical system, because 4-4-2 was old hat. by this point, and Wenger hadn't quite caught up with that. Like, he'd flirted with 4-5-1 and 4-3-3, but when he lost Fabregas, he kind of had to, and he went to a much more defensive shape. And I'm not sure if people will remember, in January 2009, Arsenal had 4 consecutive 0-0 draws, and that was immediately after Fabregas was injured, because he changed the shape of the whole team. And he said, okay, I don't have Fabregas anymore. We can't concede 1 or 2 goals a game anymore. We have to be much more solid. And he put Denilson and Song in, and so things changed there. And again, this wasn't really in the plan. This was kind of on the fly type stuff. And actually, kind of controversially, once Fabregas came back from injury in April, Arsenal went on this brilliant run that got them to 4th. And when Fabregas came back in April, they started losing again. And that's not because of Fabregas himself. It's because they went back to the more open formation. And it wasn't until the next season that Wenger thought, right, I need Denilson, I need Song behind Fabregas. I need 2 of them. Like, I haven't got Flamini anymore. I haven't got that one player who's capable of running around so much, because Denilson and Song had different qualities, but between them, they weren't capable of covering loads and loads of ground. And so he kind of changed things, and he went to more of a more modern 4-3-3 shape. But all of this was very, like, you can tell it wasn't really in his plan, and things had been, the apple cart had been upset, and he was kind of, I think his head was spinning a little bit, quite frankly, with what was happening. And then he had the Gallas Toure thing at centre half. I don't think that really worked. And actually, Gallas and Toure fell out during this season, and Toure ends up leaving. And, you know, because we had a tiny back 4, like Sagna, Clichy, Toure, Gallas, not great in the air. And when you buy Mikel Silvestre to be the backup to that lot, you don't really solve any problem, but you don't solve that problem either. So we had this tiny back 4, and we had Denilson and Song protecting them. And, you know, we kind of almost went back to the days where we were getting bullied again. Yeah.
And I mean, from front to back, just the way the team went from looking coherent, if not perfect, to incoherent. I mean, you're talking about 86 starts off, you know, just at a glance, that you lost in the summer between Flamini, Rosicky, Hleb, who else was it? Flamini, Rosicky, Hleb, Eduardo, right? I mean, so you look at those starts and you look at who replaced them, and honestly, it really is the Project Youth period that starts sort of the next season, because that's when you wind up seeing players like Theo come more into prominence. Denilson, as we mentioned, Aaron Ramsey gets, 9 league appearances. Alex Song makes 31 league appearances. And this is where it does start to become Project Youth a little bit more, and just kind of an incoherent team. The one thing that the 07-08 team had going for it is you had a lot of players that made the lion's share of league appearances. The very next season, it's 22 for Cesc, it's 16 for Diaby, it's 28 for Nasri, it's 24 for Van Persie, it's 16 for Theo, it's 23 for Song, and you go through the whole squad, and it's like that. Ironically, and to your point, Tim, Denilson at 36 starts is really the ever-present in the squad that season, along with Sagna at 34. So, that is really the change. And I'm curious, Paul, another player, we talk about Adebayor, was he ever really as good as we thought? Eduardo lives in the memory. He's sort of a legendary player at Arsenal because of what happened to him that night in Birmingham. But, he made 17 league appearances, 13 starts. Obviously, he wouldn't play again until the very late part of the next season, and he never really had an Arsenal career after that. How big a difference would it have made, both in the subsequent season and long term, if Eduardo had stayed fit? And what do you think his ceiling was? I mean, have we kind of given him the Diaby treatment, made him bigger than he was because of the injury status, or do you really think that we lost the potential for a superstar?
I don't know about superstar, because time's a factor in that, and we didn't see a long enough period of him with us.
Well, I mean, we've all got Martinelli already better than Pele, so lean into whatever you want, man.
Yeah. So Eduardo arrives, and at the start of this season, he's not playing every game. So his 17 appearances there, is a brief glimpse in time, but it's also over a short period in time. And while he was there, he was very influential. I mean, I think the reaction to him, there's a danger always in just measuring anything by one-dimensional stats, by goals or assists or whatever. But I think you saw the difference when he was on the pitch, in terms of how the team played, of the creativity, the movement, the befuddling of the opposition, that we would find a way. So I think he, beyond his numbers, belies the fact that I think he gave us a degree of unpredictability and impact in the final third that we started to lose later on in the season. Obviously, Fabregas being the major piece of it, losing him had always this big impact. And as Tim said, when he came back, it didn't necessarily mean we started winning, but learning to win without him, or learning to have an impact without him, and then getting him back, then readapting to him. He was always the talismanic figure. So whenever you lost him, or whatever was going on with what Fabregas was going on with Arsenal, I think Eduardo was a big deal for us. But I think it also speaks a little bit again to the fragility of this team. I mean, in this game, we talked about Kolo Touré. He was captain for this team, which is kind of an interesting one. I didn't quite remember it that way, but yeah, apparently captain at this point tells you a little bit of about the senior figures going out and coming in. We had Gilberto Silva in the back four, as Tim talked about, our narrowed options, because I think Senderos wasn't available. So, like I say, it's kind of interesting. I think there was a lot of inherent fragility in this 07-08 team. And yeah, we were on a roll. But maybe we think of losing one player, or losing Eduardo and a bit of Fabregas as being the thing that turned the season around. And it may well have been, because you need a little luck in these things. But we were definitely on thin ice. And it was certainly heyday for the walking it into the goal, or at least that's what everybody said. It was also a heyday for Mark Clattenburg losing all his hair. That was quite funny. Miraculously sprung back from there. But we were definitely trying to play the perfect game of football, and it was wonderful to watch. But I think we were riding our luck through in the season, in terms of you can't just outgun everybody all season long. And even with that Adebayor's season, you can see again in this game, you see the best and the worst of Adebayor. He scores a one cracker at the end, but by then we had the game won. And the number of frustrating moments you have with him, the two or three other goals that he should have scored, or you can't miss, blah, blah, blah. But certainly it was classic Adebayor. And in some ways he had two good seasons. This one, and I think it was a 10-11 or something at Spurs. He had another strong season with goals and assists. But mostly in this game, it reminded me how frustrating he could be to the team. And that was an issue for us in 08-09.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask you this, Scott, in terms of the players that kind of left or were unable to play, whether it was Eduardo through injury, Rosicki through injury, or Kleb leaving to Barcelona quite incredibly, or Flamini leaving on a free to Milan. Is there a player that, had they been available for the totality of the next season, the next several subsequent seasons, could have really changed the trajectory and kept it from being a reset? Is there one of the players that left in that next window of departures, whether it was right away, or maybe even you could add into that like an Adebayor if you want, but between Eduardo, Adebayor, Kleb, Flamini, is there one of them that you think, had that player at that point stayed fit or stayed at the club, that the trajectory might have remained upward?
I think if you're just looking at going into the next season, I think Flamini was probably the most, because of his partnership that he was able to do. And then also looking at what was actually behind him, for the next season. So I think that one was probably the most important. I think Rosicky as well, just because of his ability to kind of be that connecting of the, to attack and defense. So then the midfield to be able to do all of that. I think those were probably the two biggest losses going into the next year. I think, you if those players are available going into that next season, a little bit less dependence on youth, you can kind of blood them in a little bit more, I guess sensibly, instead of just throwing them straight into the deep end. I think that probably sets Arsenal up for a little bit better going over the next 2 to 3 seasons. Even if there was just one more year of Flamini, that would have been a huge thing. I understand, from his perspective, he ended up getting the best deal for himself, doing this free transfers all the way through his career. But, it is just something that's just disappointing from an Arsenal perspective.
Yeah. Is there, when you look at maybe some of the opportunity that developed because of these departures, I've been looking at this just in terms of the negative, go figure, why things got bad, why it was a reset, losing the players. But do you see an opportunity, something that as a result of one of these departures or one of these changes may have made way for something to happen at the club that was a positive arrival or development?
Well, I think a lot of this stuff really informed some of the things that Arsene Wenger did later. As a project youth, he really kind of thought, well, I'm going to, really go all in on that. And, maybe if we bring people through the club this way, maybe they'll have more of a, an affinity for it and want to stay longer. That didn't quite work out. So then he pivoted to, the British core, thinking that same thing, if, maybe these people have an affinity towards Arsenal, maybe they'll stay a little bit longer. So I think a lot of what happened in this period kind of colored how he went through building teams into the future. Neither of those quite worked out perfectly, but I think a lot of that was, just the way that Arsenal were, kind of perched in the league.
Yeah. It's tough because there were players that wound up coming to prominence at the club that obviously wouldn't have. And, players like Nasri who arrived and was fun for a little while and then he fucked off too. So it was hard to get really attached to anyone at this time. And Tim, emotionally for Arsene Wenger, what do you think the blowback from this was? This started a period of players missing a lot of time injured and leaving shortly after making their name there. And I think, if I had to rate Arsene Wenger's performance as a coach, period by period by period, I would put the period between, 07, 08, maybe even through 10, 11, 12 as one of his best because of the amount of minutes and games missed to injury and the amount of players that the moment he had something in them, they left. And I don't really think it was until maybe after, the Ozil arrival period that we started to see him really start to get some things wrong. How well do you think Arsene Wenger handled the tumultuous period that he entered at this point now with players coming and players going, Adebayor hitting prominence and leaving, Nasri arriving, hitting prominence and leaving, Fabregas going, Van Persie going to United, losing Jack Wilshere basically for his whole career, losing Rosicky and Vermaelen and Eduardo and Ramsey. It was an incredible feat, I think, that he kept us as competitive as he did, both in Europe and in the league. And, how would you evaluate the way he reacted to those changes, really notably starting with what happened to this team?
Yeah, I think it was up and down. So I think, yes, he did manage some of that quite well. But at the same time, he has some responsibility in some of those things that happened. Some of those players left for a reason. And I think the thing is, this is the point where Wenger kind of, whether it was his fault or so I think it's a mixture of the two, right? I think there was a little bit of bad planning and there was a little bit of bad luck. And seeing, either injuries or players quitting, and it became a bit of a vicious circle. But I think he became a bit of a back of the cigarette packet manager during this time, in terms of some of the seasons just look so badly planned to me, which is why we had this real peak trough thing going on from this season onwards through to probably about 2030. Well, but it possibly never ever went away. This kind of peak trough crisis management that I think we fell into, and actually some of the best things that he did in this time, or the best football that we played, was usually kind of by accident. or usually stuff that was stumbled upon. When you think about, like, I don't know, Coquelin and Cazorla, for example, like accident, stumbled upon. And I think a lot of this started to happen, or, you know, he'd try to play one way and things would go really badly wrong. So he'd stop and he'd do something else. You know, like the time he dropped Vermaelen and Chesney at the end of 12-13 because he was desperate. And he put Fabianski in and he put Koscielny in, and it worked because Arsenal went into this kind of, well, let's be tight, let's contain, and we played Ramsey as like a defensive midfielder, and it worked. And he went, okay, we've had 10 really good games there, let's try and get expansive again. And he'd try and it wouldn't work. And I think we fell into a cycle here where, you know, particularly looking back, I look back on this time now and I kind of think, yeah, there were things that happened that were beyond his control, like injuries and things like that. But the impact of injuries is less if your planning is better and your squad is better. And I wonder if Arsene Wenger looks back on some of this era and just goes, fuck, I really wish I'd just bought a centre-back that January, you know? And actually, he did start to do that towards the end. You know, he did start to do the kind of, you know, I'm buying Gabriel in January. We need another centre-back. This is ridiculous. I'm doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd point to the Leicester season, not getting himself a midfielder when Cazorla went down and playing Coquelin and Flamini the rest of the way, costing us a title as maybe a counterpoint to that. Yeah. But I just wonder if he looks back on some of these seasons, or when he had to start playing Arshavin up front because all the strikers were injured. And that happened in December, and we've got that. And so it was like, okay, we can do this for a couple of weeks, but then it's January, and, you know, we can get like a strike. And like, he just didn't do it. And I just wonder if he looks back and thinks, and it all seemed to be in the kind of name of planning. But when I look back, I think, when I look back at this era, honestly, I wonder how much of it was really planned. Because like the stuff like Denilson and Song coming into the team during the 08-09 season, I get that, because Denilson and Song were already at the club. He'd already bought them. He already saw them as part of the future, whether he probably not this soon, and they were probably first team fixtures slightly earlier than he anticipated, but he wanted them there and he saw them as part of the future. But after this, I think it just starts to unravel a little bit. And yes, he does some crisis management quite well, but that crisis was at least partially of his own making. And I think, but I think the one thing I'll say in his defense that's difficult, right, is if you're a manager and you're looking at your groups and you're writing down names of players and you're like Flamini, Rosicky, Hleb, Fabregas, Song, Denilson, you know, you don't look at that group and think that's a problem area and I need to be really smart here. And you think, I'll talk Flamini into re-signing, and Rosicky's injury is a thigh, he'll be fine. And, you know, Hleb is coming off a great season for us. And then Hleb somehow goes to Barcelona, and Flamini you can't talk into a contract, and Rosicky misses 18 months, and Cesc plays half the season. And, you know, I'm not saying that you don't have to do a better job reacting to that in real time, but you know, I mean, I have some sympathy for the idea that you look at the names on the paper and you think you've got a good group, and by the time you blink and it's late July, you either don't have that group or injuries start stretching out longer than you expect, and it's difficult. And I think he went through a lot of periods like that. And I can also understand being gun shy about buying in a way, because this was, if you remember, when Arsene went into his "if I buy a player, I kill this young player" argument. You know what I mean? And I can understand why he felt that way, because he's like, what? I'm going to buy Nasri and lose him in 2 seasons. I'm going to buy Adebayor, and when he comes to prominence, I'm going to lose him to City. Or I'm going to buy Hleb, and he's going to have an amazing season for me and almost help me win a title, and then he's going to go to Barcelona the next season. Like, I can understand why you'd be gun-shy about buying players to play in lieu of the young players when all you feel you're doing is leasing them for a year to fuck off again. You know what I mean?
But then that's... and this is possibly where he went wrong. That kind of always happened. At the beginning of his reign, like Anelka fucked off and he bought Henri. Overmars fucked off and he bought Pires. And maybe looking back, maybe he just went through this massive fucking hot streak and he got lucky 6 or 7 times and it carried us through. And then, there was a reversion to the mean and he got really, really unlucky. I don't know. I don't think I think about it like that, but it's a possibility. Like that kind of always happened. But what we did really well in that period was we got paid when those players wanted to leave.
Such a good point, Tim. Yeah, that's how you build a team, right? I mean, that's what you want to do. You want to lease players and sell them for more than you bought them for and buy a better replacement. Yeah.
Yeah, and instead what happened was he kind of stuck with, Song and Danielson and I'll say this, Wilshere as well. When it was kind of, I understand more with Wilshere, but I think it was quite clear that the injuries had fucked him, and not just the injuries. I do think that there was a part of Jack's brain that was never going to let him be a top class footballer, and we held on and we held on and we held on when, really I think it would have been much better to like refresh and renew. That's what he did brilliantly in the first part of his reign that he kind of stops doing at this point, and it kind of lets that staleness creep in.
I find it so difficult to evaluate this period because there were things about it that I think are really great and things about it that I think were really mismanaged. I mean, the Fabregas interview with Arsblog is great because you kind of get it from the other perspective. And certainly the Xavi Alonso transfer that never happened, I think could have made a big difference. Paul, let me just ask you a hypothetical. If the 07-08 team stays together for a period of several seasons, let's say 2-3 more seasons of really staying together with that group, was the ceiling what it looked like, or was it an illusion? What would that team have accomplished if it stayed together and didn't suffer the horrific injury? So you get Rosicky playing as much as you want and Eduardo playing as much as you want. And I realize football doesn't work that way. Injuries do happen, but not the sort of catastrophic season-robbing ones.
Well, I think this team would still have needed something to push on and to achieve the level we saw in the first half of this season. It was 10 at the back. I think I said Senderos, but it was Silvestre that was missing from the back line for this game. There was just that vulnerability, the fragility, where on our day we were going to be great. We would outscore you 3-2 or whatever. But I'm sure, well, I'm not sure. I'd like to think that Wenger was looking to add some additional steel to this team, but that's a conversation we had kind of every season. I did feel maybe after 07-08 that he did kind of a pivot to the more romantic values notion of football and a little less away from the Alex Ferguson, what do we need to do this summer, this transfer window, because we're going to win the league. And I think Arsene changed a little bit. I think his resources, I think foisted on him was a scenario in which he was not going to have the same resources as his biggest opponent or opponents. And I think there was a part of his poetic soul that said, okay, let's do this differently and better. Not with more money, but with leaning more into the values that he believed in. Maybe though he'd always had a discomfort at spending at the top levels and wanted to do it by kind of the purer football philosophy of develop. He enjoyed developing young players too much for that not to be his preference. And so this was kind of a breaking point for him in terms of a season, which driven by the whole Emirates move, and this kind of coming apart towards the end of the season and the seams coming apart, and he was asked to take on a challenge, and I think in many ways he embraced it. What would he have needed to do with this team for it to kind of keep and attain these levels? He was still going to have to add some. He's going to have to add some in defence. The midfield was pretty exciting. Had he kept Flamini, that would have bought him time, as you kind of alluded to, for Song to come through. And Song needed the competition. And Danielson talked about his own challenges in the Premier League. Maybe that having the senior players ahead of both of those guys would have given them a guide. I mean, you see in this Spurs game just how effective and how focused Flamini could be when at full physical powers. Kleb was quite the force in joining the dots. Rosicki came on in this game as a substitute late in the game to impact it. We had Diaby, who was fit and strong and coming through, playing a role in this game. And so if you get to hold on to all of those players, your midfield's pretty strong. I think it's just the defence that needed a little shoring up. And as Tim had talked about recently, I mean, this was peak Clichy. He had almost a man of the match performance against Spurs. He was in form. Sanya was in form. You add a little depth to the centre backs, and then you only have the issue with Almunia, who went full Almunia in this game, and a few others.
Can't stand him.
So you were always going to have that little thing at the back. Great at times, absolute calamity at other times. But yeah, I think this 07-08 team with just a little more steel at the back, keeping all those players and them staying fit, man, that'd be a force. I think 08, 09, 09, 10, it wouldn't have needed too much more. Centre backs are probably the thing we were missing.
Yeah, and you know why I think I have a little sympathy for Arsene too is like he'd have this ray of light, like the 07-08 season, and the fans would be like, we're back, we've got something special. And then something would conspire, and part of it would be Arsene making mistakes, but it'd be injuries, it'd be people requesting to move, and then you'd have a bad season, 08-09, when Arshavin's got to come in and rescue top four. 09-10, I believe, wasn't very good. And then it would click again. You know, Van Persie would have a fit season, and Nasri would hit his peak, and he'd get the mix right, and things would go back to being good, and we'd have a good season. And then Van Persie would fuck off to United, and Seska and Nasri would leave in the same summer, and we're back to having a transitional season that's no good. And then, you know, an Ozil arrives, and everything looks like it's going to be good again, and Alexa's good, and, you know, and then it would fall apart again. I think the rhythm of what we went through, of having these false dawns where it looked like Arsene had put something together that could really become special, was undone, not always by his own making. You know, I mean, the Van Persie departure, Nasri and Fabregas departures, the departures after the 07-08 season, it was a lot. And then you combine it with injuries, whether it was Eduardo and Rosicki, whether it was Vermaelen and Ramsey, whether it was Wilshere, you know, whatever the injuries were, it all made it very difficult for any continuity to be strung together, and I do have some sympathy for that. But when I look back at the 07-08 season, I will remember it aesthetically as one of my most pleasing seasons, and I'll just remember it as a season that, for whatever reason, sticks with me. And, you know, not all of them during that period did. So Scott had to go. He was needed. We're going to leave it there. I've got a music interlude for you. I got music. We're going to do music. But before we do that, let me say goodbye to Paul. You can find him on Twitter at Pause in My Pants. Thanks, Pause.
Woohoo!
Tim's on Twitter at Stoberto. Thanks, Tim. Tim, did you go away when my mic went away?
My pleasure as always.
There we go. Thanks, Tim. Okay, this is quite the end of the pod. Technically masterful. I blame COVID. But okay, so next week we're going to talk to you about some charitable giving that we can all do together. But before that, here's what we're going to do. So I got approached on Discord by a patron. He goes by the name Old Dirty Eric on Discord. And I presume that's because he's old, he's dirty, and his name is Eric. He has produced a song, okay? And together with the singer In Limbo from Sweden, the song is called Slowly. We are getting the chance to debut it to the world. It's a sad pop song with airy ambient vibe mixed with trap drums. The lyric video and song will be available on all major platforms from 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time, U.S. today, but we get to play it for you first. So I hope you like it. It's a really good song. It's from an Arsenal supporter. It is from an Arsenal Vision podcast supporter. And for all those reasons, I'm glad to debut it here. So we love you. We'll talk to you after Arsenal 20 COVID-19. And here is Slowly from Old Dirty Eric and In Limbo. Enjoy.
I've been scared since I walked alone. I will never care, nothing personal. I'm losing faith on my own. I'm falling in a haze. I'm losing track of the days. I feel it coming now, so slowly. I'm already there, so scared, feeling so sick in a heart.